and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us wherever you are today. It's an honor to have you with us. I'd like to acknowledge that I am representing from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations peoples. Our organization is founded in Vancouver, BC, and we are committed to the work of truth and reconciliation with our First Nations people who have suffered for centuries from white supremacy of various kinds, starting with colonization. I want to thank our speakers for joining us for the event today. Those on the call, as well as those who, due to scheduling difficulties, such as the Honourable Minister Marco Mendicino from Public Safety Canada, as well as our colleagues from the New Zealand Consulate who are going to discuss the Royal Commission. We'll be publishing this event online where we receive most of our views afterwards and hope to include their video messages. March 15th, 2022 marks the third anniversary of the Christchurch, New Zealand massacre, where 52 Muslim men, women, and children were murdered by a terrorist who was motivated by violent white supremacist ideology. The International Forum on Transnational White Supremacist Terrorism is held to help educate and inform stakeholders, including governments, institutions, and members of the public, regarding one of the most pressing and ongoing threats to our national security. Since 2001, far-right extremists have killed more Americans and Canadians than Islamist fundamentalists, but it's often difficult to discern the prioritization of the way governments are handling the threat. The majority of resources of successive governments has been dedicated to investigating different forms of terrorism other than domestic. In 2019, the FBI reported 80% of its counterterrorism budget was devoted to international terrorism. An intelligence report this year warned of the threat of racial extremists from domestic extremists. It stated that the threat had become more deadly than terrorist attacks from abroad, and that there's an importance to reallocate resources to deal with what's actually happening. Even though white supremacy and other far-right extremist movements may have many supporters or seem to have many supporters, the groups themselves are disorganized and riven by internal conflict. Members often disagree which targets to prioritize and who should lead, and many are untrained in the efforts that they're trying to conduct violence. These are all opportunities for us collectively to take advantage of and help to bring an end to this security threat. Our speakers today have over a century of lived experience or expertise in addressing the threat of white supremacist terrorism and ideology. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Robert Ray, who is Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations. Ambassador Ray served as the Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995 and was interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He was elected to federal and provincial parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013. He received his honors BA in modern history from the University of Toronto and his master's in politics as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1977 and was named a Queen's Counsel in 1984. We are honored to hear from you, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you tonight. I think we all recognize the seriousness of this day, of this anniversary. This is also the day in which the United Nations has passed a resolution indicating that this will be a day in which the issue of Islamophobia will be addressed globally. And so it is, I think, even more significant that we are holding this event on this particular anniversary. I just want to say a few things to everyone. The first one is that we need to understand the roots of white supremacy thinking and how widespread it is. and frankly, how deeply ingrained it is in our cultures. As has already been said, the issue of anti-Indigenous racism has been part of the culture of Canada for a very long time. We have struggled against it. We have struggled to overcome it. But in the process of truth and reconciliation, we've had to recognize how deeply seated it is in our historic ways of thinking. I think looking particularly at that issue is important for Canadians and for North Americans to understand that the arrival of European settlers in North America was, and not only in North America, but in fact all over the Americas, was featured some very serious and deep-seated strains of, first of all, religious superiority, racial superiority, and a great deal of violence. And these are historical facts. This is not rhetorical talking here. This is actually what the birth of our national experience was all about. More broadly, I think we can say that the rivalry between different empires, the rivalry between different religious groups has been a feature of our life, not just for a few hundred years, but for a few thousand years, and understand how that has been very much a feature of the thinking and the acting and the way of behaving that has led us to where we are today. We can't imagine our current globe without understanding the nature of imperial thinking. Imperial thinking is shared by a great many different cultures and countries, and it's always imbued with a sense of exceptionalism, a sense of mission, a sense of superiority, which is allegedly born based in very much the cultures of imperial countries, and conflict between imperial countries and what other peoples has been a feature of world history for millennia. So I mention this only because it seems to me we have to kind of situate where we are and understand that these issues did not suddenly arise because of the Oklahoma bombing or because of the awful situation in Christchurch or other terrible examples. It's arisen out of a long process that we have to come to terms with before we can successfully overcome it. I think it's increasingly being understood in governments around the world that this terrorism of the new right or of white supremacists or of whatever groups we come together at various places and various times to express their thinking really came to a head, in a sense, in Europe in the middle of the 20th century or after the First World War, when racialized thinking took hold of right-wing thinking in Germany and Italy, and even in the Japanese relationship with other cultures in Korea and China. You can see clear signs of people thinking that they, again, going back over the ground, they think they're exceptional, they think they're special, they think they have a unique mission, they think they're called by God, or they're called by some supernatural force to carry out what they refer to as a civilizing mission, in which what happens to others is, in terms of violence and conquest, is simply a natural expression of the survival of the fittest. In the 19th century, Darwin was misused and abused by a lot of racialized thinking and distinct sort of thinking that this was a scientific theory, that the theory of genetic superiority tied in very much to this sense. Previously, it had been more spiritual superiority or political superiority or simply the superiority of power. But then it took on a kind of, quote, scientific notion, which is bogus science, but nevertheless has had tremendous power and tremendous force. In the United States, of course, we can see slavery as an expression of it, but it's important to recognize that slavery was not just an American phenomenon. Slavery was a global phenomenon in which the alleged superiority of whites over blacks was expressed. The wars of the Crusades were fought between Christians and Muslims on the premise that one religion was superior to the other and that one religion had the right to be in a certain place and the other religion did not have a right to be in a certain place. So there are clear religious overtones to the nature of this phenomenon that we see with its strands still alive today. The Russian Empire had senses of its own superiority over other nations and other races. And we're seeing signs of that today in the position that's being taken by President Putin with respect to Ukraine, where he doesn't recognize the separateness or the otherness of Ukraine or its right to independence or to chart its own course. So those theories of racial superiority become part of his way of thinking and his way of acting as well. It's important to understand that this is a complex phenomenon. It's not a simple phenomenon. But it's also important to understand how widespread it is and how deeply, as I said before, embedded it is in some of our cultures and some of our ways of thinking. So here am I, a 73-year-old social democrat, liberal, pluralist, the product of both Jewish and Christian culture, struggling to understand where do liberal values go in the face of this kind of terrorism and violence. And here am I also, and I mention my age not because I think I've had it or I'm past it, but because I recognize that the technologies which are at work today have become instruments of hate. The internet has we thought the internet was going to be a place that allowed people to learn. It would be like a university of the air, which everybody would be learning and sharing information. Instead, we find that the internet is a cauldron of hatred, misinformation, disinformation, lying, propaganda, which is allowed to take over people's minds and it infects them with these crazy ideas. 4 years ago, I was asked by the Prime Minister to try and understand better the crisis in Myanmar that had led to the expulsion of nearly 1 million Muslim Rohingya refugees from that country into Bangladesh. And I went there thinking, not knowing a lot about the nature of the ethnic conflict, but coming away with a profound sense, which I'd had 20 years before, in looking at the conflict between Buddhists and Hindus in Sri Lanka, where racial hatred and senses of racial difference and racial superiority were dominant features in have been dominant features in both of those conflicts. And in the case of Myanmar, where the internet was able to feed immediately, because the country did not have any internet, no social media were allowed. So suddenly you had an experiment where in 2005, the military said, let's have the internet, let that happen. What happened? The internet became the basis upon which Facebook became the platform of preference for those people who are spreading hate and spreading violence. And now we see the result of that in a conflict, not only with the Rohingya, but a conflict by the military, which represents the Bamar plurality of the country, and a sense of the superiority and the sense of the vulnerability of the Buddhist culture in the face of all the forces of modernism around them, and asserting that their nationalism is the best means of expression, and carrying that out through a process of terrible violence against various minority groups and other racial and religious groups which exist in the country. It's an appalling situation. So I mention this from the global perspective because we need to understand how it's not limited in time or place to one country, how it is a global phenomenon, but it's not as easy to categorize as perhaps other forms of revolutionary extremism or terrorist activity of one kind and another. But they're all based on the same notion of people having a mission, people having a sacred mission, people having a responsibility to carry out political acts against innocent people, to kill innocent people in the name of God, or in the name of racial superiority, or in the name of theoretical or ideological superiority. And all of them are just appalling. They're terrible ideas. But our problem is that we don't know how to face up to them as effectively as we need to. And in the case of white supremacism and white terrorism, if you like, use that term, it's based on, it comes too close to the history of different parts of the world for people to say, wait a minute, we're going to have to deal with this in our midst. We're going to have to deal with this issue, which is our issue. Instead of blaming the other for this, we have to look at ourselves and figure out where does this stuff come from and how do we root it out. The good news, and this is what I leave you with, is that I actually do believe governments in the West are getting the message. I think they understand that when you create a plural culture, as we have done in all of our countries to some extent or another, we have a particular responsibility to make sure that everyone is respecting the nature of pluralism, and that everyone has a stake in dealing with extremism, whatever form it takes, whenever it comes. And that we expect our intelligence services that work on our behalf, and our police services that work on our behalf, and our military that work on our behalf, to be aware of the presence of these forces and to deal with them as they spew hatred and spew violence. It's not an easy thing to do, because our notions of liberalism are sometimes based on the fact that we live and let live, that we don't engage in dealing with hate until it takes on the form of violence. That as long as it's not directly creating violence, that we just say, well, it's just there. There's nothing to be done about it, and we have to just reason with it and hope that it will somehow magically go away. But the reality is it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away unless it's combated effectively, and unless we understand better what its roots and origins and what are the forces at work that make for its success. I have to say that it's primarily a male phenomenon. And so it's based not only on ideas of superiority as it relates to race or religion, but also gender. It's frequently accompanied by gender violence. And the authoritarian personality, as Theodor Adorno, the great German-American sociologist, described it many years ago, the authoritarian personality has a problem with any of these challenges to their unilateral power or their ability to take over and abuse other people. So in short, my friends, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge for the world. And it's a challenge that I think we have to all take much more seriously than we have. There's more studying of it going on. There's more documentation of it going on. There's more, I think, sense that we have to work hard to root it out and to deal with it and to identify it as the very threatening force that it can be. And we have to be aware that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, as has been said. that in fact our freedom requires us to deal with those who would use our freedom against us. And that, I think, is something that's hard sometimes for people to fully understand and embrace. We have to be more resilient in the face of an intolerance that will in fact destroy us if we don't deal with it. And that isn't about making thoughts a crime, but it is about understanding that hatred festers. It festers on inequality. It festers on a sense of grievance. It festers on economies that are not fair or just. It festers in worlds in which people have fewer chances and fewer freedoms and fewer abilities to express themselves than they think they should have. I think we're seeing and experiencing this, the irrationality of some of it in many of its different forms. So I can only tell you that here at the United Nations, I feel a certain, an even greater sense of responsibility to speak out about it in a way that makes it clear that it is these forms of hatred can actually infect any culture, and they can take many different forms, and it's important for us to understand that no culture is immune to it, because we've seen, just in my little historical survey, you can see all the examples where it's still there, and where it expresses itself in forms that are violent and that are dangerous and that represent a threat to the peace of the world. So I'll leave it at that. I could go on longer, as my friends know. When I get riled, I can go on a bit, but I really appreciate the chance to speak to you. I think this is an important occasion. I think it's an important opportunity for people to think and hear about the extent to which this is a problem. And finally, I think it's really important that everyone feel that it's partly about them, but it's also not about them. And I don't want anyone to feel that somehow they are alone, that they face these forces of hatred by themselves, and that essentially they're the only ones who can deal with it, and therefore they're going to have to take things into their own hands. It's up to our sense of solidarity to make it clear that we are going to be living for the foreseeable future in a world of different religions, in a world of different values, in a world of different perspectives. We're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other, but we're also going to have to figure out how to be stronger in the face of hatred. And the thing we know about hatred is that one day it'll come after you if you don't stop it from coming after somebody else. And I think that's a lesson that we've all had to learn. History of the 20th century has been a difficult training ground. We haven't always applied the lessons that we should have learned, but we have to come to grips with its impact and why this is so important. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you. Sorry, I can't stay. I have something else on my plate. No rest for the wicked, as they say. But I really appreciate your coming together and look forward very much to hearing about the outcome of all of your deliberations. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you, Ambassador. There is such value in understanding these historical threads that weave together into the trends that we see today. Your mentioning of the genocide in Myanmar is quite prescient, actually, because our next speaker, she literally wrote the book on Facebook's complicity in the violence. Dr. Heidi Beirich holds a PhD in political science from Purdue University and is the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. For the 2 decades prior to founding the organization, she served as the director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, where she monitored, issued reports about, and trained officials on far-right extremist activity in the United States. An important part of that work involved providing information about the threats these movements pose to not just racialized communities, but also law enforcement and intelligence officers in terms of both domestic and global terrorism and their threat online. Heidi is an expert in the dangers of the Great Replacement theory, as well as the need for tech reform to address the spread of online hate and disinformation resulting from, as you said, not freedom of expression, but the weaponization of social media. Dr. Byridge, it's an honor to have you with us tonight. Thank you.
Oh, it's an honor for me to be here. Thank you so much, Yusuf. And I want to thank the organizers of the forum as well, and the ambassador for setting the scene so well in terms of historical developments and these forces that tear us apart. So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. I think it's an idea that is coursing through white supremacist circles. It has been for some time, and it's very important when we think upon the horrific terrorist attacks that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand 3 years ago, and we think about the families and the victims. So I'm the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. My organization is dedicated to exposing white supremacy and hate-driven organizations. We work to counter them. And the most important part of our mission is we are attempting to protect diverse democracies from the onslaughts of racist and white supremacist ideas. And when I think about Christchurch, it's a reminder of what white supremacy can lead to. And it's a reminder also of the power of the online space to recruit and radicalize people into hate movements and what I consider to be the most dangerous white supremacist ideology, the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. This idea, which I'll explain in a second, is the same one that inspired the Christchurch attacker, but also the attacker at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, the El Paso Walmart massacre, attacks at synagogues in Germany, and many, many other incidents. And this is an idea that isn't bounded by borders. It is shared by white supremacists across multiple countries, and it just courses through the web. So what is the Great Replacement conspiracy theory? It's an idea that white supremacists believe that white people are being displaced in what they consider their home countries by people of color. Predominantly, they're talking about immigrants and refugees. Oftentimes, this is also an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory where these extremists blame Jews as being behind this so-called plot, arguing that they are specifically bringing in people to weaken the power of white populations and destroy white countries. This twisted theory is also sometimes referred to as a white genocide by racists. So what is this about? Where is it coming from? Well, this is really how white supremacists are reacting to the increasing diversity all across the Western world and in multiple countries and multiple democracies, because they, of course, denigrate people of color, refugees, immigrants, and others. They've come up with a quote unquote conspiracy, a theory, as they call it, to explain why demographics are shifting and populations are becoming much more diverse. Of course, there's no plot behind this, and none of these things that they believe are true. But because these demographic trends aren't going to change anytime soon, I really think that unless we take serious steps, we're going to be able to expect more violence from people who believe in this terrible idea. So the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, it was actually first formulated by a Frenchman, Renaud Camus, and it made its way like wildfire through white supremacist communities. And it also fueled some major transnational sprawling hate networks, in particular one called Generation Identity that has over time had chapters all over Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, etc. It's a highly networked world, so it doesn't necessarily have to be that you're a member of this organization to interact with it. And it's this group actually that the Christchurch assailant donated money to and learned some of the ideas that made their way into his heinous manifesto, which of course was called The Great Replacement. I just want to say that these ideas don't exist only as a motivator and a recruiting tool in the online space. The Generation Identity group actually had a network that was so big that they had an American helping to raise money in the United States from other white supremacists on an online platform. That money was then fueled into Europe, and used to actually hire a boat that was staffed by Generation Identity people that went around the Mediterranean on a mission to round up migrants. So there are real world connections between the white supremacists who organize online and what they do with the money that they raise and then use in the real world. The other thing about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is it has very much now penetrated the mainstream. It's not just fringe white supremacists who believe the same ideas as the Christchurch attacker did. We now have in the United States politicians who are parroting this theory, including officials elected to our Congress, to the federal government. We have a Fox News host, Tucker Carlson, who has taken up this idea, and many, many people who are running for office at the state and local level. So it's really frightening to think that something that is so terrorist inspiring is now being picked up by part of our political system and used increasingly by people who are in the quote unquote mainstream. The idea also motivated many of the people who stormed the Capitol here in the United States on January 6, 2021. So it's permeated into those areas. A large chunk of the people who were involved in the storming, but weren't necessarily in extremist groups, have come to believe the Great Replacement to be true, and also believe in things like the QAnon conspiracy theory. So this has become a very, very serious problem for American society and other places. And I just want to add too, for these white supremacists, and the ambassador mentioned this, we should always remember that these ideas are also connected to all kinds of other forms of hatred. White supremacists are likely also misogynist. They're probably anti-LGBTQ, anti-Muslim, et cetera, et cetera. So they have these positions are all sort of mixed up in these dangerous movements. The other thing I want to say about this too is these are ideas because of the history of many Western countries and their histories of white supremacy that are indigenous. And that means that they're probably not going to go away unless we do something about it, that we confront these ideas, just as the ambassador was talking about. So I just want to mention a little bit of the work that my organization is doing to try to deal with the online space. It's the one place where if we convince the major tech companies to deplatform this material, we can reduce their ability to recruit into their movements. It's very important to do this on the mainstream platforms because that's where extremist groups have the widest audience. There are always going to be places like Telegram that are unregulated where they could do these things, but they don't have as big of an audience to speak to. So actually, the very first report that my organization did documented the existence of Generation Identity on Twitter and YouTube. And Twitter actually deplatformed the network, but YouTube, which has always been more reluctant to take action against extremist groups, has kept a lot of those channels up. It is sort of beyond me how it can be the case that they want to host on their site videos from groups whose ideas are connected to that many terrorist attacks. And yet, after a lot of lobbying, we still have that problem there. So our organization spends a lot of time lobbying both governments to consider different ways to push tech companies to remove this kind of hatred from their platforms. But we also work in large alliances to try to push for change. We are soon going to announce a new global alliance against digital hate and extremism that involves about 70 organizations for around the world. And this new network is going to take on not only online hate, which should be deplatformed like the Great Replacement, but also other things that are allowing these ideas to penetrate further into the mainstream. One of our particular goals will be to try to change social media companies' rules that allow politicians and influencers to violate hate speech and other community standards and disinformation standards that the rest of us have to follow. And this has obviously been done because these are people who have massive amounts of followers, have a lot of influence, drive content, and companies like Facebook/Meta have simply allowed them to run riot. This sort of came to light when Donald Trump was removed from Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And now we realize that that same access that Donald Trump had to spread his bigotry and hatred is also allowed at the hands of other politicians, like, for example, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who has engaged in, anti-indigenous comments, anti-LGBTQ comments, but also, for example, members of the BJP party in India, including the leader, Narendra Modi, who have engaged in anti-Muslim hate speech that has been connected literally to massacres and mass killings. This has got to stop. And one of the things the Global Alliance is going to do is to push very, very hard to get rid of these carve-outs for leaders whose words carry much more weight than the average individual. There is a whole lot of work to be done in the digital space, and it's going to take all of us to change a dynamic where, for example, as the ambassador mentioned, Facebook could be used to orchestrate the genocide of the Rohingya. We just can't allow this anymore. And as long as these sites are allowed to fester with extremism and hatred, we are going to have not only more Christchurch attacks, but perhaps everything up to including further genocides and mass killings. So it's absolutely a priority. So I want to thank you all for having me on today. It was very nice to be here.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's always an honor to hear your in-depth perspective and knowledge, and I want to congratulate you on the amazing impact that you've been having in addressing the shared concern for all of us here. And one of the key things that I think is a major takeaway is that, as you said, it requires alliances. It requires real-world networks of people to come together to address these shared challenges that, even though we might all have different backgrounds, we are all experiencing the outcomes of online disinformation, campaigns, misinformation, activities, hatred, and dehumanization of other communities, leading to what arguably could include war, as we're seeing in Europe today. So thank you so much for the work you're doing, and we look forward to seeing the amazing outcomes of your initiative with the Global Alliance Against Digital Hate and Extremism. Thank you, Heidi. Our next speaker is Evan Belgord, the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. He's an investigative journalist and researcher covering the rise of the new far-right and hate groups in Canada. Evan is a fellow of the Munk School of Global Affairs, fellowship in global journalism, and graduated with an honors Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto, a double majoring in psychology and sociology. He served as a vice president of the Canadian Association of Journalists and is a non-academic affiliate of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, for those who might not be aware, is an independent, nonprofit organization made up of many of Canada's leading experts and researchers on hate groups and hate crimes. Their mandate is to monitor, research, and counter hate groups by providing education and information on those hate groups to the public, to media, to researchers, to courts, law enforcement, elected officials, and community groups. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. That's on a personal level. I've been following the growth of the new far right in Canada for going on 6 years now. And I wanted to share some takeaways that help me understand how we get to the Ottawa occupation and the convoy today, which is kind of the largest far right populism thing Canada has going on. And when I started this work back in 2016, 2017, the number of individuals that I would peg as being part of Canada's far-right movement was much smaller. At the time, they were largely animated by the recent election of Donald Trump and the recent election of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And their rallying cry, though, really was about Muslims. When the government tried to, did do a motion 103, which would condemn Islamophobia, rebel media and many others said that this would criminalize criticism of Islam more broadly. And they started having demonstrations in Toronto and in major cities across Canada. And this is the time when we saw groups like Soldiers of Odin and others taking part. And as a reporter covering it, it became very clear to me early on that this wasn't even really about religion. We'd hear speakers say things like, I don't hate all Muslims, and then in the same breath say, all Muslims are practicing taqiyya, all Muslims are lying to you because they want to take over the country. They obviously didn't get super far with that. M103 passed despite their objections, and they went into a bit of a slump because they lost their lightning rod. At the time, there were maybe 10, 20,000 individuals who were kind of sympathetic with this anti-Muslim, anti-Islam movement. Then came the Yellow Vest movement, actually in France, and there was an anti-austerity protest with many different facets, but the important thing is that they wore yellow vests. Here in Canada, they saw those really heated protests and they started calling themselves Yellow Vest Canada. But from day one, it was all the same individuals and organizations really involved on the ground floor that we were already watching because they were anti-Muslim hate groups. However, because they said, we're not racist, because they called themselves Yellow Vest Canada now, because they said this is also about oil and gas and Western separation, they drew a lot of people into those Facebook groups. And if you joined that Facebook group early on, thinking it was about oil and gas, you'd be subjected to a lot of racism, death threats towards Muslims and the prime minister and people of color who are members of his cabinet. And if you raised any objection to that, you'd be kicked out of the group almost immediately, right? So it really became a space where a bunch of people got sucked in thinking it was about oil and gas, perhaps, but then we're fed a steady stream of kind of racist and nonsense content. And a lot of those individuals ended up radicalizing themselves. So at this time, there were maybe 250,000 Canadians who were part of these groups. Then came COVID, right? So Yellow Vest Canada actually had its heyday. Its biggest thing was probably its United We Roll convoy. And it was a convoy taking their grievances to Ottawa. It was not particularly successful, but you could look at it as a dry run for what just happened with the occupation of Ottawa. It had the same organizers, several of the same key individuals and propagandists. But back then, their convoy kind of fizzled. They didn't get the number of people they wanted. They didn't have as good of a plan. They didn't actually occupy Ottawa. So the Yellow Vest movement kind of went into a recession until COVID. And when COVID happened, all of the people who already kind of were conspiracy theorists or were racist grabbed onto COVID because, not just cynically, because that's where they can reach the most people, but also because they truly believe the COVID conspiracy theories, right? When that happened, their potential audience for people that they could talk to and reach expanded hugely, right? Expanded to all the Canadians who are kind of vaccine hesitant, who were getting fed misinformation from social media platforms. And that's a huge audience they now had access to. And they took those people and they really turned it into an insurrectionary far-right populist movement. That's how we got the convoy, right? The main demand of the convoy, they said, was about this one trucker issue, but then when they arrived in Ottawa and occupied it, they said they wanted all mandates ended. And now they're still carrying on their demonstrations, even though many mandates are ending, because they say that's not enough. They want the politicians put on trial for treason, right? They are looking for a non-democratic change in government. And many of them are looking for those people, when they are put on trial, to be killed. So we have all of these elements, and people always say, well, aren't you being unfair to the convoy? And I will say one thing to that, right? Not everybody who is there is necessarily a racist or necessarily wants to do violence, right? But their organizers come out of a far-right movement. A couple of their organizers made very Islamophobic statements in the past about how the Muslim Brotherhood has already infiltrated our politics and is taking over Canada. Others have made other kinds of racist and anti-Semitic statements and saying, these mandates only end when there's with bullets. One of the other organizers, James Bowder, again says Trudeau needs to be tried for treason. So they arrive and they have all of these grievances. So we have a far-right populist movement. And the one thing that I really want to explain here is the takeaway is that in spirit, this is the same issue we were dealing with the anti-Muslim stuff back in 2016 when it was really focused on that. We're dealing with a far-right movement that grows and never shrinks. When people got radicalized during the Yellow Vests, those same people became part of the COVID conspiracy movement and the convoy and the occupation. So the people today who are getting involved in the convoy and the occupation are ready to be mobilized for whatever the next thing is, whether that's support for Putin and Russia, as we're seeing some people in the convoy play with supporting. We're not exactly sure what the next thing will be, but there's going to be a lot more people taking part of it. So that's why we're in kind of a dangerous place right now, because we have two dangers that we kind of look at as an organization. We look at very extreme cells of like neo-Nazi terrorists where we're concerned they might go do something. But we're also worried about the far-right populist movement because threats we can't really monitor come out of it, right? The individual, for example, who had his head full of conspiracy theories and rammed his truck into Rideau Hall with a bunch of guns saying he was just there to talk to the prime minister and give him a letter, right? Incidents like that occur organically out of this far-right ecosystem, which has grown so large. So that's why I am more concerned about the broad far-right conspiracy movement, more so than I'm even concerned about the cells of would-be terrorists that we keep an eye on, because we can keep an eye on them. We have a much harder time keeping an eye on a broad-based populist movement. And we did get here largely because of social media, right? The effect of social media cannot be overstated in this. Social media companies knew what they were doing, knew the harms it caused, and did it anyways because it was good for their engagement and how much money they make. So there's a couple things that we can do moving forward to help our situation. One of which is as Heidi was talking about, we need regulation of these social media companies led by government. Right now, the government is still moving forward with an idea of regulating online harms and having some kind of independent regulator to rein in the social media companies to some degree. That's wonderful. And it's an issue we should all be involved in, because even though 80% of Canadians support doing something about it, there's a very small but very vocal group of academics in ivory towers who are creating, making it into a big controversy about free speech, when really the number one speech issue today is that hate speech, death threats, rape threats, and things of that nature silence women, people of color, and two-spirited LGBTQ+ individuals. That is the free expression issue of our day, not whether or not a Nazi gets to say everything they want to say on social media. So we need to put that into perspective. We need to be pushing for that online harms legislation to be as good as it could be. But there's only so much we can count on governments and law enforcement to do for us when this really is a societal problem. And the most effective thing I've seen in all of my time doing this is what really demoralizes the far right and suppresses their turnout for events is mass mobilizations against them. And I'll give a good example of this. When a bunch of convoy participants were coming to reinforce the convoy on the second weekend, a pretty spontaneous group of Ottawa residents blockaded them, stopped them from driving in with all their vehicles, talked to them. And then when they agreed to scrape off their decals and surrender their flags, they were allowed to slink off, right? It was a very effective mobilization of just people in a neighborhood. And we've seen other mobilizations, mass mobilizations that have been very effective. The Toronto one was fairly effective as well. Some people drove into Toronto and they wrote back to the convoy group, we were there and everybody was giving us the middle finger and shouting, F you, F you. I've never felt, so attacked in my whole life. This wasn't pleasant. I'm not going to do it again, right? And that's good. Like that kind of all of society condemnation of these far right groups needs to happen, because it has a very important effect. The extremists are going to keep doing it, but their supporters are going to be more reluctant to show up with them. So it kind of separates the wheat from the chaff. That lets us keep a closer eye on the extremists, and it means that they won't hit those kind of critical masses they need to turn a protest into a riot or to turn a convoy into an occupation. So that's one of the things that we should be focusing on moving forward, is encouraging these mass mobilizations, mass peaceful mobilizations to disrupt far-right organizing. I have been in meetings with labor leaders over the last couple of weeks, and there seems to be more appetite in getting organizing and boots on the ground to show that condemnation in a well-organized fashion. And that is very encouraging to me, because we are sorely bereft of it. But that's the path forward. We can poke the government to do a few things that we very much need them to do around online harms, but we also need to talk about organizing and getting boots on the ground to shout F you and to throw the middle finger at these, far right populist groups, because that's part of the bigger solution to it. And I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for including me.
Thank you so much, Evan. Again, the importance of us as a society making it crystal clear that such hatred and dehumanization of others has really no place here. is important in helping to mobilize our community. I mean, there's an old saying that in a democracy, people are ruled by who they deserve. And what that means at the root is that without education and public engagement, things can go astray very quickly. So for anyone who's not on the Canadian Anti-Hate Network's newsletter, we highly recommend it. It is very informative about the current state of what's going on in the world today, especially here in Canada, but also for those in the United States who might want, or around the world, who might want to have a broader appreciation of the trends and the outcomes. It is an excellent resource. So thank you so much, Evan, for being with us here today. Our next speaker has a very important role in coming together with the legislation that you mentioned as an elected official. MP Tlaib Noor Mohamed is elected in 2021 for Vancouver Granville in British Columbia. He is a member of the Standing Committee for the Security of Scrutiny of Regulations, as well as with Public Safety. MP Noor Mohamed earned a Bachelor of Arts from Princeton University, a master's degree in International Education Policy from Harvard University, and attended Oxford University for his doctoral studies. He was awarded the Governor General's Caring Canadian Award and the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Thank you very much for being here with us, MP Noor Mohamed. Please.
Well, thank you so much, Yusuf, and thank you for putting this event together, to you and to the foundation. This is a really important topic, and I wish we didn't have to gather to talk about it. But the fact that we are where we are today in this world, the fact that we have to be having this conversation, I'm glad to be a part of it. I was reflecting, one of the challenges about coming after Evan and Heidi and Bob is that a lot of what I wanted to say has been said. But what I've been reflecting on, over the course of the last few weeks, as we've been talking about today's gathering, is just what has happened over the course of the last 3 years. We saw what happened in New Zealand. We saw what happened with the Afzal family. We saw what happened in Oakville. We saw what happened, we just marked the anniversary of Quebec City, but we also saw the chance of Jews will not replace us. We saw the chance of blood and soil in Charlottesville. This is all in the last couple of years. And so what worries me as we talk about this topic is the connectedness of hate, the connectedness of this sense that somehow the idea of building pluralistic societies, of building diverse societies, of embracing difference, of engaging in difference is somehow a dilution of whatever the majority group might be in this case, which feeds to this idea of white supremacist nationalism, violence, and extremism. And, Doug Saunders wrote a piece today in the Globe and Mail that is incredibly timely, and he really looked at this idea of the rise of white nationalist or white supremacist ideology, and he really dug into the links that happened globally, the link between Canada and what happened in Christchurch, the fact that the terrorist who committed that crime donated to Rebel News, the fact that there were articles published in Rebel News that really asked the question of whether diversity was a code for population replacement. And you've heard others today talk about this ridiculous theory that somehow this is all some grand conspiracy to eradicate an entire community. And the reality is that, and we think about the organizations, here in Canada and other places, Soldiers of Odin, the Proud Boys, Yellow Vests, these are not organizations that seek to build safer communities, to build better communities, to build sort of a sense of engagement around ideas. What they seek to do is they seek to spread not just misinformation, but they seek to spread this sense of hate. And the thing that is most troublesome is that we have somehow forgotten or ignored the fact that since 9/11, far-right extremists have been responsible for the majority of acts of terror, of lives taken in the United States. white supremacists now are the greatest domestic threats facing the United States. And I quote specifically those whose violent advocacy for the white race. Study by the Center of Strategic International Studies shows that 41 of 61 terror plots and attacks in 2020 were at the hands of white supremacist group. Even under Donald Trump, the DHS, Chad Wolf, the acting director, said he was, quote, particularly concerned about white supremacist violent extremism, which has been exceptionally lethal. And so the reality that we are facing is that we need to figure out how we understand what is going on. Bob talked about the root causes. I think we have to talk about why. We have to talk about how this is happening and what we need to do to understand it so that we can respond. And I think this is where government has a role to play that is quite significant. The first is that, we need to understand the problem. So what are we doing? Right now, as some of you will know, I had put forward a study at the the Parliamentary Committee for Public Safety and National Security, to actually look at ideologically motivated violent extremism. And we need to focus on this, and we need to make sure that we really dig into this, because we know that this is a major risk to Canada. Evan spoke eloquently about the roots of Ottawa, what happened in Ottawa, the United We Roll convoy and sort of the dry run pieces. And so we have this opportunity, I think, through the idea that by learning and by understanding, just like we're doing today, and then doing it in a parliamentary setting, of really getting to the root cause of what is going on, getting to the root of what we need to do as a country, and I think as global citizens, to address this insidious problem that we are seeing happen in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in other parts of the world. Because if we don't, the risk that we end up running, frankly, is we start to normalize behavior. We start to normalize these types of conversations. How many swastikas or how many extremist symbols, how many Confederate flags at a protest are okay, and at what point is it not okay? And my view is that one is sort of that limit. You have one, you've had too many. But the idea that we somehow create exceptions because we can apologize or we can explain things away, to me, is deeply problematic. I would submit that if we were, for example, if there were a gathering on Parliament Hill of Muslims and we saw ISIS flags start to show up, the response that we would get, the response that we would see, would be very, very different from people explaining away the 1 or 2 or 3 Confederate flags or swastikas on the Hill. And that is because, for whatever reason, we have not yet come to understand the gravity and the severity of extremist white nationalism. And one need only look at what happened in Charlottesville in the United States. One need only look at what happened at Christchurch. When we only need to look at what happened at the mosque in Quebec City to realize that this is a problem that is here. It is in front of us, and we need to deal with it. And so I think the first piece of this is understanding it through the work that we are doing as parliamentarians, and making sure that that translates into some meaningful and responsible action. The second thing I think we need to take on is the idea that we cannot simply accept the notion that there is no way out of this, because there is. And in some sense, the way out of this is actually for us to be thinking about the idea that we build a culture of pluralism. We build this culture of pluralism, and we really lean into it by making sure that we all reject the fundamental premise that any one group is better than another. Look, our families, many of our families came from places where we saw the impact of colonialism. And you saw how the colonial master had a view on the local communities. And, that becomes ingrained in the psyche of people, that you are somehow lesser, and we are not. And I think the reality is that no one is lesser, no one is better. And I think if we start to accept that notion as we build into this concept of building pluralistic societies, and we start to reject the idea that by leaning into diversity, that somehow we are taking away from Canada or the United States or the countries in which we live, I think if we reject the idea and we start to show the value, and the value is clear, of what it means to build these types of inclusive communities, I think it strikes at the very heart of what these hate groups are trying to do. You take the oxygen out of the argument by showing that the argument actually has no value. And the way that we do that is by showing that there is actually a tremendous amount of value to everybody in building diverse communities. And that's the easiest way, I think, to take this stuff on. It's hard work, but it's the easiest and simplest way, in my view. And we have to educate on the spread of misinformation. And we've talked about social media and the role of social media. And this is something that we have to lean into in terms of making sure that platforms are not permitted to spew hate. You know, this idea that somehow restricting quote unquote free speech is more damaging than the speech itself is actually totally inaccurate, in my view. Because there are limits to the types of things that we can do. There are limits in the ways in which we should be conducting ourselves. And the idea that somehow it is an affront to say no to hate speech because somehow we are preventing someone from speaking their mind, when we don't think about the consequences, we only need to look at the consequences of what happens when you start to spread hate online. When you spread hate online and people buy into those conspiracy theories, people buy into those ideologies, what you start to see in response is violence. And you can't unring that bell. And so I think it is important for us to realize the consequences of misinformation, the consequences of the spread of hate online, and that those consequences are real, they are severe, they are felt. And in fact, in many cases, they are fatal. And so our opportunity, I think, is to really look at this not as somehow when we start to talk about regulating social media, when it comes to white supremacist violent extremism, to say that it is curtailing people's rights, but rather seeking to make sure that we are preserving the lives of others who may be taken as a result of some of these actions. So where does that then leave us? We have government's ability to look into these things and respond. And we've had already, I think, from our government, a very clear signal, and we continue to give that signal that this is something not only do we take seriously, that we want to make sure we seek to eradicate, we seek to stop. You've seen groups like the Proud Boys listed as terrorist entities. There's a civil society role, like the role that we are seeing being played today, and having these conversations and making sure these conversations are candid, are frank, are in many cases unfiltered, because we do need to challenge, we need to push back on the idea that this is not a problem. I think we need to look to civil society organizations, we need to look to academics and others who are writing about this to say, look, there is actually a very real set of circumstances we face if we don't start to take this more seriously, and if we don't start to stop these types of behaviors in their tracks. And finally, I would say that there is an obligation, in some sense, on all of us to start to ask the questions around root cause. The root causes are something that we don't often like to talk about, but root causes are critically important, and root causes often come down to two things: lack of social integration and education. And we have, I think, an opportunity to really think about how we are going to make an impact on educating people, on being more proactive in opening people's minds to the fact that the threat that we face when we start to other people is incredibly serious, but the opportunity that we have when we start to be inclusive is actually remarkably powerful. You know, in British Columbia, it is now going to be essential. It's going to be a requirement that young people to graduate need to take Indigenous studies. And what does that do? What that does, as an example, and Bob talked about this at the beginning, is it starts to build into people's understanding at a very young age how we got to where we are, and the importance of understanding Canada and how Canada came to be where it is. And I think for all of us, we play a role, whether in whatever country we come from, we play a role in building the history of that country, of building a history of that place. And part of the opportunity, I think, that we should be thinking about taking on as we battle forcefully against ideologically motivated violent extremism, as we work against sort of this proliferation of white supremacist violent extremism, is to really make sure that people see the problem for what it is. You know, see the problem in a way that this is not just about a large scale sort of sense of folks who are aggrieved. This is a small group of people who are seeking to disrupt the society that we live in. You know, we always talk about, and I always, as a Muslim, am very sensitive to this. You know, when we talk about terrorism, we talk about extremism, we have always said we don't want to all be painted with the same brush. And I think it's important for us in this case also to know that this is a small, narrow group of people who are seeking to foment discord and seeking to sort of really undermine the fabric of society. And we need to take it at its face. We need to take it seriously. We need to make sure we have a response to it. But we should not at the same time conflate what they are trying to do as a trend in general society. This is not what general society is all about. And I think the sooner that we can further kind of shrink down, and I don't want to call it marginalized because marginalization leads to more of this, the sooner that we can shrink down the number of people that are buying into this by showing them tangibly just why this is so fundamentally wrong and counter to their own interest, I think the farther we get. And at the same time, we have to be prepared to take the fight on in a way that actually causes law enforcement, causes those that are doing the work in legislatures to take this problem on, own the problem, and own the opportunity of solving it before even more terrible things happen. So what I would leave you with today is really two thoughts. The first is that as we think about our opportunities, you know, as people from diverse backgrounds that are really interested in solving this problem and addressing it in a meaningful, tangible way, is to remember that we have an opportunity ahead of us. We have an opportunity to identify the problem, understand it well, to seek to deal with it at the same time as we educate people, at the same time as we educate people on the value of taking the problem on and the counterpoint of the problem, which is to build inclusive societies and communities. The other, I think, is that we accept in perhaps a much more serious way the fact that this is a reality we need to deal with and that there are consequences to ignoring it. And that when we look at the data from the United States, we look at the data from Canada, we look at other parts of the world, we are starting to see that this is becoming the number one risk, the number one extremist risk that Western democracies face. And so if we take that problem on with the same seriousness that we have taken on other forms of extremism in Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, and other parts of the world, the probability of a successful outcome is quite great. But it's a call to action in many ways for us to take this far more seriously than we may have in the past. Because if we don't, I guarantee you, we will see more versions of Christchurch. We will see more versions of what happened in Quebec City. We will see more versions of what we saw in Charlottesville. And that is not what the vast, 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 vast majority of people of any ethnic background want. But if we don't actually take the steps today to take it seriously within government, within civil society, within law enforcement, and within communities at large, we'll be looking back and wondering why we didn't do those things in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So my hope is that the conversations we are having today spur on within government, within civil society, and within communities at large, a real kind of push to ensure that we are engaging in these conversations, that we are seeking to do the research, we're seeking to push academics, push public officials, push law enforcement to take this on seriously. And I know that the group of folks that are speaking today will be leaders in that fight, and all of you that are engaging in these conversations are going to be, you know, vitally important to making sure that we get to a society, we get to building the type of society we want, which is one where it is peaceful and where everyone, regardless of their background, can feel safe and secure in their existence, and know that it is not an exercise in diluting anyone, but really an exercise in building one another up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talib. That was a very well thought out and presented holistic experience for, I think, our viewers, many of whom might not know the causes of why we're here or what can be done about it. I think it was inspirational how you solved. For some people, maybe like the fear that this is targeting a certain communities, when it's not. It's a collective Canadian challenge that we're all experiencing. So thank you so much for sharing the perspective and your words with us today. We really appreciate it. In fact, following from one of the last things that Lee mentioned about the importance of government working to educate and to address this challenge, both within government and within Canada, is something that our next speaker can speak to. Mr. Peter Fledgel is the Executive Director for the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. So the Government of Canada, they created a anti-racism secretariat that is the cornerstone of the Building a Foundation for Change, which is Canada's anti-racism strategy. In addition to coordinating federal action and driving the overall strategy, he and his team are responsible for working with federal departments and agencies to identify and coordinate initiatives, identify gaps, and consider the impact of new and existing policies on how it affects people, and especially, as Talib just mentioned, Indigenous peoples, so the First Peoples of Canada. Peter has a distinguished career as a social entrepreneur, a fundraiser, a columnist, a community organizer, and a musician. He has a broad understanding of Canada, Canadian heritage, Canadian culture, and a history of leadership within government, NGOs, and philanthropic sectors, including in areas such as diversity and employment, human rights, anti-Black racism, Indigenous issues, homophobia and transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the challenges that our youth are facing, as well as the unique issues surrounding culture and multiculturalism and identity here in Canada. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me, and bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis vraiment ravi d'être avec vous. I'm joining you this morning and this afternoon, I should say, and this evening from Ottawa on the unceded and surrendered traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I really want to thank the Foundation for Path Forward for the invitation to join you all for this really important discussion on transnational white supremacist terrorism. Really, I'm here today to reaffirm that the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat is really committed to stand by your side, listen to you, support you, and collaborate with you so we can all move forward towards eradicating the real threat of white supremacy in our country. And that includes having the courage and foresight to name the problem for what it is, as you have done, white supremacist terrorism. While I'm honored to be here today, like many speakers, I wish there wasn't a need for this conversation in the first place. Historically, Canada has been reputed to pose a low threat of domestic or international terrorism, and this is really due to the idea that our domestic and international intelligence sharing practices have resulted in preventative measures and actions and prosecution of individuals associated with terrorist organizations. But that view obviously does not account for serious concerns that have been raised about the racial profiling of Muslim and Arab people and other racialized folk and Indigenous peoples and religious minorities, and the consequences that it bears. And nor does it account for the alarm bells that rang as much by intelligence services, academics, or grassroots groups across the country, calling us to pay heed to the looming and very real threat of white supremacist radicalization, extremist agitation, terrorist threats, and violence in Canada. And concomitantly, researchers and reporters have been warning of the laundering or mainstreaming of white supremacist ideologies through the weaponizing of plausible deniability to express ideas designed to help unravel the basic rights and freedoms which historically marginalized communities and peoples have really won for themselves over the last century and beyond. This, of course, as many speakers have pointed out, has become particularly stark with the weaponizing of precarity and vulnerability tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. From the attack on a Muslim family in London, Ontario, to the rise of anti-Semitism and the increased acts of violence against members of Asian communities and physical assaults against Black Muslim women in Alberta since the start of the pandemic, the threat of oppression continues to loom over peoples and communities with lived experience of racism. And again, as many have pointed out this evening, the recent controversy surrounding the convoy in February across our nation serves as a stark reminder that Canada is not immune to the rhetoric or to its effects. It's only one recent example where overt displays and incidents of hate have been witnessed. And let me be clear, we're not confronting a series of isolated social ills or simply ill-intentioned individuals. Rather, we find ourselves wrestling against all-encompassing ecosystems of hate, entrenched in oppressive and violent principles of white supremacists. And we are witnessing an increase in the recruitment of people who are immersed in white supremacist ideals, and the risks of radicalization and adherence to white supremacist ideas that are magnified now more than ever before, as many have pointed out. And we must also acknowledge, as you have done, the transnational dimension of the problem, the dark money that is funneled to support white supremacist groups, often through the veneer of what would appear to be respectable channels. The capacity for white supremacist terror groups to strategize and operate transnationally, and the ubiquity of these groups operating on online platforms to spread hate, disinformation, and misinformation multilingually and across the globe. All these factors demonstrate the need for us all to work more effectively across geographic borders to combat the scourge of white nationalist terror groups and their ideologies, which has been said really to be a whole of society, if not a global problem. So that's one of the reasons that the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat is really proud to lead on the creation of a North American Partnership on Racial Equity and Inclusion, which was announced last November by Prime Minister Trudeau, President Biden, and President López Obrador of Mexico last November at the North American Leaders Summit. The purpose is to enhance collaboration among allies in combating systemic racism, discrimination, and hate, and to advance racial equity and inclusion across the continent. So, dear friends, today's gathering presents us all with an opportunity to come together and commit once again to confronting this growing tide of hate and reject the false narratives that are driving this movement. It is only through working with Indigenous peoples, as well as racialized and religious minority communities and other equity groups, that we can and will stand firmly for justice. And there are efforts and initiatives at the federal government that I'd like to share with you briefly in the next few minutes. And I'd like to begin by sharing a bit about the work of the Secretariat, which is acting and operating as a hub, a convener, and a catalyst within the Government of Canada, with a mandate to lead a whole of government approach to addressing racism, discrimination, and hate. Since 2019, we've convened thousands of Indigenous, Black, Asian, Arab, Latinx, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and several other racialized and religious minority leaders across the country within sectors of civil society. We've done this to engage and center the voices of communities and peoples with lived experience of hate, racism, and discrimination. These engagements have taken place through a variety of events, including the National Summit on Anti-Semitism and the National Summit on Islamophobia, which we organized. Over 400 recommendations from community have been gathered through these engagements. And as I speak, my team is using the information to inform preparations for the renewal of Canada's anti-racism strategy. And we're really looking forward to engaging directly with many of you here this evening in building the new National Action Plan on Combating Hate, which has been mentioned in the mandate letter of the Honorable Minister Ahmed Hussein, Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. So we've heard from community and political leaders, academics, activists, and members with intersectional identities that we have a long and arduous struggle ahead of us against whether it's anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of hate. That is why it is really important for us to work collaboratively with you to see the government take all the necessary measures to put an end to hate in Canada once and for all. So we acknowledge, as has been emphasized today, that there's still so much work to be done, but want to reiterate that the Federal Secretariat and Government of Canada's commitment to working together with community partners like you to address the real threat of transnational terrorism, white supremacist terrorism in Canada. Together, we must be vigilant in the fight against white supremacist radicalization and work alongside one another to prevent the growing tide of hate from dominating our nation. The Government of Canada will diligently continue to explore ways to better serve the needs of diverse communities and peoples across the country. And so we stand with you and are fully committed to work together with you to build a better, safer, and consciously more inclusive Canada. Nous nous tenons à être à vos côtés et nous nous engageons pleinement à travailler avec vous pour construire un Canada plus sécuritaire et consciemment plus inclusif. So thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you, Peter. We also continue to have hope that these challenges will be resolved when there's people such as yourself working on them with such passion and wisdom. And one of the things that we've seen, especially in the last few years, has been the government's approach to dealing with this challenge has been much, much more direct than previously. I think one of the first things you said was the importance of naming things as they are and not beating around the bush and calling them, what might be more palatable, but not identifying the challenge of, white supremacist ideology and terrorism that we're facing here. And you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the importance of empowering communities and individuals to have an active role in addressing this, because this is a shared concern for, as we've seen all our speakers say, this is an existential issue in our time today, how to help address the people who are becoming susceptible to the ideology, as well as the people who are becoming victimized by those who go all in. So I want to thank you, as well as your team, for the amazing work that the Secretariat is doing, has done, and will continue to do. Merci. Our next speaker today is someone who has lived experience with this issue. Tony McAleer has been involved in an organization called Life After Hate since its inception in 2011. He served as the executive director from 2013 to 2017, while Life After Hate developed its online support groups and the Exit USA program. What they do is help people exit the white supremacist or extremist movements, both here in North America, but also around the world. He was their board chair until his departure in December 2019. Tony spent 15 years in the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movement, starting as a skinhead and evolving into leadership positions. He built one of the first white supremacist websites for an organization called Resistance Records in the mid-1990s. However, today, his experience that he gleaned from that, as well as from thousands of hours on one-on-one and group counseling, to better understand the process that he went through, has helped him to become a certified life coach in helping people to exit extremist movements and ideologies. Tony has worked closely with law enforcement and government, from attorney generals to their senior staff at the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. He testified before Congress and attended the Paris Summit for the Christchurch call with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, as well as supporting government and law enforcement agencies. He's helping really to grapple with this issue of what's causing the rise of white supremacist groups and ideology, as well as what can work, what actually works to bring people out of that or to help protect them from falling into it. Tony is also the author of a fantastic book, and we highly encourage people interested in the subject to read it, called The Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist's journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. Thank you for joining us, Tony.
Thank you for having me. And I'd like to, the previous speaker, many of the speakers, Evan included, that we cannot rely on government alone to solve this problem. It really is going to take everyone as individuals to step up and rise to this challenge. This is not going to be solved from inside our comfort zones. And we make a huge mistake if we rely on government alone to deal with that. And I think I come at this from a little bit of a different angle because of my own personal experience. And, and I think it's incredibly important that we call people out, but as a compassionate society, we need to call people in and where we can, try and engage people that find themselves in that dark space. And I'll just say really quickly, the three powerful components to that engagement are curiosity, compassion, and courage. Like I said, we don't solve this from inside our comfort zone. I'm not going to talk so much about that this evening. What I will talk about is, we've talked about a lot of the challenges. We've talked about a number of different things. And I just want to talk about some of the successes that have happened in the struggle to defeat this dark ideology. And we'll start with Charlottesville. Everyone remembers Charlottesville in 2017, and in the aftermath of Charlottesville, an organization was created by Roberta Kaplan called Integrity First America. Now, she was a lawyer. I think she was on the legal team that won the case for same-sex marriage in the United States. And she decided that she wanted to build a team, and they created a nonprofit to raise the money for the legal fight, because it was an extremely ambitious one, to go after all of the organizers for Charlottesville. And this represented a very novel and new, and like I said, ambitious endeavor in taking things to the legal front. Southern Poverty Law Center has been doing something similar for ages. They were the ones that sued, I think it was the United Klans of America. I remember the time back in the day when I was working with White Aryan Resistance and Tom Metzger. They sued him for $10 million. I used to spend time at Aryan Nations. They sued Aryan Nations in Idaho, and was able to seize and liquidate their farms and the farm and the compound that they had there. And so the legal strategy that the Southern Poverty Law Center pioneered was to attack these sort of organizational entities one at a time and go after their assets. With Charlottesville, this was really the first time that they went after all of the organizers for an event. So, for example, it was the murder of Mulugata Sarah, an Ethiopian student, by a skinhead or skinheads associated with Tom Metzger and White Aryan Resistance. That incident led to this lawsuit, which took a bite out of war. This time it was Charlottesville, and they went after everybody. They went after David Duke. They went after Richard Spencer, every organization that was involved and their leadership in this lawsuit. And happy to say that lawsuit was successful. And like I said, it was incredibly ambitious. And if you think of, in order to get that successful lawsuit, yes, they had a couple of default judgments along the way, but they had to assemble the team and to sift through all of the social media and all the different platforms and what they could find and in the darker reaches of Telegram and those other places where they think they're hidden, and sift through thousands and thousands. And the original trial was supposed to take place in 2020, and thankfully, because of COVID, it was delayed a year, which really allowed that research team to really dive deep and analyze and tie all of these groups and messages together with the goal of violence on that day. And they were able to successfully do that. Around the same time, there's a realtor who I had the opportunity to meet in Pittsburgh this last year, Tanya Gersh. Now, she was the realtor that sold Richard Spencer's mother's home. And as a result of her selling his home, there was a massive trolling of her by Richard Spencer, but primarily by Andrew Anglin. And for those who don't know who Andrew Anglin is, he is the creator of Der Stürmer, which is probably the most virulent anti-Semitic and racist website out there. In fact, they've lost their domain hosting umpteen times and moved it to internet hosting in smaller and smaller, more obscure countries as he continues to do what he did. She got a judgment against him for $14 million. In the Charlottesville case, depending on who they were in their involvement, some got a lesser judgment against them, some got a more severe judgment against them, but they all got judgments against them, which really disrupted their ability to operate above ground. Now, I know, having been in their shoes in dealing with the telephone line that I had that was the subject of 2 Canadian human rights complaints, the idea that it's almost like playing whack-a-mole happened. So were they able to collect on the money? No. And this is something that's going to have echoes. And when you think about it, it might ring a bell with regards to what happened in Ottawa. And that's the use of cryptocurrency. So Richard Anglin, some of these other people, they've gone underground. Nobody knows exactly where he is. And I'll use him as an example. All of them are in various different places, but they haven't been able to collect from Richard Anglin. And he's gone underground and has financed himself completely with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and is using that to evade payment, evade collection on this debt. And cryptocurrency for a while, as these movements are generally very anti-establishment, was an obvious choice for them to move to. And although it allows people to, I've owned Bitcoin and sold it and bought it and sold it since it was $25. So I've followed Bitcoin for quite a while. And right at the beginning, as it allows people to have complete anonymity in their transactions, to transact in complete anonymity is very difficult. And what this means is that if you want to exchange money in any type of quantity, you almost have to go through an exchange. And in those exchanges is where cryptocurrency can be tracked. And I got a time to spend a little bit of time in Pittsburgh to talk with someone from FBI's crypto team. And I was actually blown away at what they were able to uncover using public and private sources of information overlaid on top of the publicly available information of the blockchain and Bitcoin. And they were able to identify these accounts, particularly when they came up for somewhere to do a transaction to get cash. So, again, the cryptocurrency piece became an important piece in the protests in Ottawa, semi-important piece. And it's certainly become an important piece with trying to track these people down and take their assets, whether that be Charlottesville or any of the other lawsuits. The good news is that the capabilities of people tracking the cryptocurrency wallets and these transactions is increasing. And I was actually, like I said, I was stunned at how much they were able to uncover in the wallets that they were able to take care of. When we look at the hackers that took down I think it was the Colonial Oil pipeline for a sizable amount of cryptocurrency, that money was able to be retrieved through the efforts of this team. And it's not easy it's easy to have crypto. It's not easy to convert it to cash. And within days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was somebody in the United Emirates trying to sell $7 billion worth of crypto. And so they pop up from here. And so I just wanted to share this with you. It's more a technological side to this story and a legal side to this challenge that we're facing, but also sometimes I know these calls for listeners can be somewhat gloomy, and it's, oh my God, what are we ever going to do? And so I thought I wanted to bring something this year that on this very important date that was maybe a little bit of good news and some strategies and effective strategies going forward that we can look to. So that's what I have today.
Thank you, Tony. I think I can speak for everyone when we say that, knowing the successes helps us to better cooperate with one another, it builds, it is a dark field to be in, to be addressing this day in and day out, and seeing that, at the end of the day, most people are legitimately caring. They are compassionate. They don't want to hate other people, and to see how we did come together to have successes is very powerful in continuing those successes. One of the most famous movie quotes of all time speaks to what you were talking about, which is follow the money. And to better understand the funding sources will help us to help sap some of the power and energy behind these groups, in essence, cutting them off from their sources of funding. So thank you for that perspective. I think it's something many of us might not have heard before, and going into depth about it is very beneficial, particularly to know that no matter what new tool those who try to spread hate or dehumanization of others might invent, there's always a way to counter it. So thank you again, Tony. Our next speaker is Ryan Chan. He is a social advocate who has a legal background from the University of Toronto. He is committed to effecting the social change needed to help advance Canadian social justice, and also serves on the board of directors at the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers, focusing on helping to look at this from a legal perspective. He's acted as a consultant for multiple organizations, including one of those dearest to my heart, which is the World Wildlife Fund, helping to address the challenge of climate change on some of the other species that are in the world today. At the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, which is one of Canada's leading social justice organizations, Ryan has worked on improving the public's understanding of how social media is being weaponized to spread hate, and also what we can do to tackle that. So thank you so much for joining Ryan tonight. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me. And just to premise it, unfortunately, unlike Tony, I am going to be kind of gloomy today. But, my colleagues like Evan and Tony, they have spoken, at length about the far right, the trucker convoy, the effect of conspiracy theories, and the effect on our democracy better than I could possibly explain. So I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss a very specific example of how the rise of far right movements has manifested itself vis-a-vis my community, because I think it demonstrates very well how institutional as well as extremist white supremacy ideologies intersect. So as you all know, the last 2 years have marked an unprecedented rise in anti-Asian hate that has rocked my community to its core. Despite the many generations that Asian Canadians have been in this country, despite the fact that 3 Chinese workers were killed for every 2 miles of railroad, our community was left fearing for their safety in the subways and questioning our place in Canadian society, all over a picture of a bat. So at the same time, COVID has marked an important milestone for our community. It has, for the first time, at least to this extent, opened up our community to speak about racism, and it has brought anti-Asian racism into the spotlight and given it the recognition it deserves. But what has come of this newfound recognition? Well, just last month, right as the convoy was rolling into Toronto, the University of Toronto, our top university, their graduate house decided that on Lunar New Year, the most important cultural celebration for many Asian cultures, in which we fill traditional lucky packets with money or candies or chocolate coins as a symbol of luck, they decided to fill them with Joss notes, hell money meant to be burned for the dead, and handed it out to students. Nobody in this entire process paused to do a Google search. Nobody paused to consider consulting the Asian community about whether this was appropriate. And nobody paused to think, I wonder if this is okay, as they filled each individual red packet with a bill that says in capital letters, Hell banknote. This is Canada's top university, and they let this happen. So I've, come up with some creative comparables for what this incident meant for our community, which I won't repeat here. But suffice it to say, imagine your community's most sacred tradition being appropriated and violated by having someone do the absolute polar opposite of what is supposed to be done for that momentous occasion. That's what this meant for our community. The time of year when good fortune is passed to one another, people were handed symbols of death, symbols that would never, ever in our culture be given to a living person. And interestingly enough, I've heard a lot of responses to this. Big institutions, they're imperfect systems, checks and balances, they just didn't hold up, blah, 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 blah. People can talk at me all day, but the only thing I take away from that is perhaps even more disturbing to me. It's that in response to this incident, instead of widespread condemnation of literally one of the biggest cultural faux pas you could possibly commit, the students and my organization for calling the University of Toronto out came under fire for making a big deal out of nothing. That we should be grateful that the university at least tried to be culturally accommodating, as though it's so much to ask that our top educational institution put up this minimal amount of effort to do cultural accommodation right. And the students hosted a Zoom event to support each other in light of this U of T debacle. The event was infiltrated by white supremacists who yelled racist slurs, and a white man flashed a gun at the camera. So I get asked a lot about what white supremacy is. And to be honest, it's a pretty irritating question because it's honestly a Google search away. But since I've told this story, I think it's worth highlighting this question and its impact on our community, because in many ways, it's perfectly captured by this one incident. White supremacy is a system by which non-white communities are seen as unimportant, such that large institutions can't be bothered to do the minimal amount of work to respect them. White supremacy is a belief that we should open our arms with unquestioning gratitude that us non-whites have been given space to be respected in this world, and that we should shut up when that respect is just yet another insult, because at the very least, they tried. And white supremacy is a threat to non-white communities that should we not obey these rules, that God forbid we stand up for our culture and our equal rights and freedoms, that we may face violent consequences. That, to all those wondering, is white supremacy. And I think that it is imperative that we do everything in our power to address it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. It's horrible to hear that. And, I will say that you're absolutely right. For those organizations or individuals who make mistakes, apologize, right? And that's the first step on the road to doing better. But as you said, ignorance is. There's a famous quote that people thought that the problem for racism was ignorance, but with the free access to information, we're realizing that that's not just it. Many people are choosing to stay that way and not, as Tony said, actually to go outside their comfort zone and just learn a little bit about the other. It's a terrible situation when students in particular who are in a vulnerable state, particularly when dealing with their administration, are subject to cultural ignorance and racism, I will say, because they should know better. They should know better and they should do better. But yeah, that was just, I think that really in a very short amount of time helped to highlight one of the key challenges we're facing, which is this even in today's world, the vast degree of ignorance that exists, even in universities in Toronto, and in U of T is Canada's leading university. And that is tragic to hear that. You did warn us in the beginning that it would be dark news, but I think collectively what we would all hope to achieve from instances like that is really the opportunity for more people to come out of it, maybe with a more open heart and a better understanding of the challenges that our communities as minorities do face in a white supremacist systemic system. So thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing that truth with us today. Folks, our next and final speaker this evening is Elizabeth Newman. She is the Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, which is a social enterprise working to end online harms such as violent extremism, disinformation, child sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, and human trafficking by applying evidence, ethics, and human rights. Ms. Newman recently served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, where she led 8 programs and policy teams addressing a range of issues, including domestic violent extremism, the screening and vetting, countering terrorism, and transnational criminal organizations, as well as human trafficking. Since departing from government in 2020, Ms. Newman has been passionately educating the public about this growing threat of disinformation and domestic violent extremism. She's done this through appearances on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, NPR 2020, and 60 Minutes, among others. And she's a board member of the National Immigration Forum, as well as a founder and member of the Council on National Security and Immigration, and a national security contributor at ABC News. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Yusuf. That was a very generous introduction. I thank you all for coordinating and facilitating the conversation. It's so important that we start talking more about this. I'm going to do something a little different than my other co-presenters. I'm going to share some slides. Yusuf and Tariq suggested that some of the interesting work that Moonshot does is better presented graphically, so I hope you'll enjoy some of that. Let me start first by sharing a bit about Moonshot. We work with governments, we work with tech companies, community organizations to end violent extremism and other online harms. It is a company that really had its origins in trying to push back actually against white supremacism and Salafi jihadism, and has expanded in recent years to address a variety of other challenges. Meeting today and on the anniversary of Christchurch holds a rather special memory for me. 3 years ago, I was at the Department of Homeland Security, and in that capacity had flown to Malaga, Spain. I was sitting at a U-shaped table with Interior Ministry representatives from about 100 countries at the annual Global Counterterrorism Forum meeting. And we were there, we actually met on the 14th, and we were there to discuss what are we going to do about those people from our countries that had gone to Syria to fight as foreign fighters. And now we needed to figure out how to bring them home, how to prosecute them, rehabilitate, or what, but not let them just sit in SDF prisons. So that was the topic of conversation. To facilitate an introduction, the organizers, the chairs asked us to go around and very quickly, all 100 of us, introduce our top 3 threats that we were facing. And in the context of an organization that came together to fight ISIS, what was remarkable was by the time we were halfway around the table, it became very clear that there was a trend. And that trend may have gone by different names, but it was right-wing violent extremism to some, it was white supremacism to some, it was racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. So different labels, but all describing the rise of a new terrorist threat. And this wasn't a surprise in that we knew we had a problem in the United States. The surprise was the global nature of it. By the time we were done, I would estimate 80% of the people representing 100 countries globally were articulating at least one of their top 3 threats coming from this movement of really, with it at its core, as Heidi said, a lot of it comes down to a great replacement theory, anti-Semitism, white supremacism. The next morning, I had to get up really early to catch a flight. I got in the cab and looked at my phone, and the alerts started coming in that And by the time we were getting the news alerts, it was very clear that it was a very devastating attack. I've been in counterterrorism for 20 years, and every time you get the news that something devastating has happened, it always feels like a failure. It always feels like we should have done more. But this one had a particular, it just really hit that something that we had not caught early enough in the United States, and arguably we're exporting to other parts of the world, was now impacting, one of the most remote parts of the world, New Zealand. And the gravity of how late we were to the game really hit me. So with that kind of personal connection to the moment, I certainly spent a lot of my time at DHS trying to figure out how we could better go after the threat, better understand the threat, and hopefully prevent the threat. When I left government, I had the opportunity last year to join Moonshot. And part of the reason I'm so excited to be with them is that they are looking at how to earlier intervene with the problem. I want to give a little content warning. Some of this material is language used by white supremacists, so just a little warning in some of these displays. This is a search entered into Google by an individual in the United States the day after the Christchurch attack. This same search was replicated across the globe in New Zealand, in Norway, the United Kingdom, across dozens of countries, numerous languages, across search engines. Moments like this are not liable for takedown. You can't remove a Google search. You can't block it. And more often than not, when you search for violent extremist content on Google, it presents in the top search results. So content moderation and removal, it's important. And I applaud the work of the GIFCT and some of the tech companies and what they have done in that space, but it's not the solution to violence and extremism online alone. Moonshot was set up with the intention to develop and use technology which would both help us understand the spread of violent extremism, but also to use the internet to actually reach people and intervene. So how do we do that? How do we find audiences at risk of violent extremism? In the month following the attack, Moonshot tracked white nationalist activity on search engines in New Zealand. This approach to gathering data has allowed us to track appetite for violent content, including searches indicating an intent to commit acts of violence or a desire to support or join violent white supremacist groups. Search traffic is non-performative, right? So as opposed to social media, search traffic offers a very unique opportunity to understand individuals who may be looking to consume white nationalist content. Every search is also an opportunity to reach those at risk of violent extremism and change their paths. Individuals at risk of violent extremism often leave behind a trail of clues in the online space. These are often publicly available clues. It's a digital footprint letting us know the path they're taking. So what we've done at Moonshot is developed databases of hundreds of thousands of online indicators of risk. This is important because we are never looking at an audience based on socio-demographic information. It is always about the behaviors online. It is people who are posting, engaging, sharing, or actively seeking hate and extremist or terrorist content. So we're looking for keywords and phrases used by these movements. We're looking for racial slurs, propaganda that they share, the music that they listen to, the content that's glorifying their heroes. We built tools that can wade through the publicly available data to find those who are leaving us a digital footprint telling us that they are at risk of being involved. Once we do that, we have developed ways that we can intervene. So our intervention campaigns specifically aim to reach people at risk of consuming violent extremist content. or endorse such, and instead offer them safer alternatives at off-ramping into disengagement and reintegration programs. So here's some examples, some basic user journeys that you see on the screen. If people were searching for violent content or to join a violent group or engaging this content on Twitter, they would be presented with an ad. Looking at the first example, you'll see it's 3%ers, which is a far-right militia group. So someone searching for this would see our ad, and if they chose to click the ad, we would redirect them to alternative content designed to speak to the underlying drivers that push people into the world of extremism. We also redirect audiences to mental health services, alternative resources. Last year, one campaign we ran in the United States helped initiate over 150 individual one-on-one counseling sessions with our partners at the Crisis Text Line. During these highly responsive campaigns, we are constantly testing different messaging strategies to optimize the alternative content and improve engagement with the target audience. Our approach is underpinned by a general finding, and you've heard a few speakers actually reference this, particularly Tony. What we have found is that extremist audiences are most receptive to non-ideological psychosocial interventions that rather than explicit counter narratives or content that's trying to undermine the ideology. You intuitively know this when you get into a holiday dinner conversation with your crazy uncle and you think he's wrong on something. You eventually give up trying to argue him out of his ideology, because the ideology is usually very set and very difficult to move somebody off of. But when we're talking about the concept of extremism, the ideology is actually the layer on top. There were other psychosocial factors that drove somebody into that extremist ideology in the first place. And what we find, and this is borne out by research done in the academic community, but also by the results that Moonshot has done globally, what we find is that people are much more likely to engage with that self-help and social service content as opposed to countering their ideology. So for example, 3 years ago, we found white supremacists were 48% more likely to engage with self-help and social service content than the general public. And when we were looking at people that were searching to join a violent group like the KKK, they were 115% more likely to click on that content, the social service and self-help content. The trend holds in every geography we try it. Across ideological spectrums, even non-Western settings, these results hold. Last year, we ran some tests in Indonesia. We had audiences engaging with Salafi jihadist content online, and they were 128% more likely to engage with psychosocial content than with ideological counter content. Here's a really interesting factor, and I think in the context of COVID makes a lot of sense. This is very particular when the intervention, that ad references loneliness. Think about that. When the ad referenced loneliness, there were 41% more likely to engage with services. So one of the things that we take away from this is that how we are intervening matters, and we can do it both in the online space, but we can also help offline intervention professionals by quickly at scale being able to figure out given what the current culture, what the current narrative is, what messages are working, what messages are less likely or less effective in that given moment. Let me move the slide to this next one. I'm going to switch topics just a bit and focus in on some work we've done in Canada. We saw a really big increase, a 19% increase in attempts to access far-right hate content in Canada's 6 largest cities during the initial early days of the pandemic. Now, here's the good news. Canada was actually significantly less of an increase than the United States. But let's think about that. Why does that happen? We know extremist movements thrive on crises. for white supremacists in particular, they have an ideology that is premised on this notion that a race war is coming. So crises are these moments where we typically see actors exploiting high levels of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and they're trying to turn that into an opportunity for recruitment. The COVID-19 pandemic gave that opportunity, along with other concurrent crises. And now that we've been in this for 2 years, that prolonged period of crisis, we are seeing extremist actors essentially preying on vulnerable individuals in our communities. Another thing that we've been working on with Public Safety Canada is understanding the involuntary celibate phenomenon. So often called incels. They're a community whose online activity increased pretty significantly during the pandemic. We were able to work with Public Safety Canada and publish some of the first guides, the first systematic multi-platform study of the incel ecosystem. All of those guides are available on our website. But this work involved consultations with global experts, frontline service workers across Canada, and produced recommendations for interrupting the incel radicalization process and responding to violence in Canada and internationally. We've already seen that this important work that actually Canada led in is being reused and copied by Europe and the United States. So one of the things that was interesting in the study is that unfortunately Canada is a center of discussion in the incel community. Incels are fixated on Canada's progressive and feminist agenda, and they argue that any advancement of women's rights diminishes the rights of Canadian men, especially incels. They frequently glorify and occasionally incite acts of misogynistic violence in Canada and idolize perpetrators as saints who have sacrificed themselves for their community. So, of course, after the horrific vehicular attack in London, Ontario last June, we immediately saw posts inciting violence against Muslim Canadians and sharing propaganda from the Christchurch attack. So the other interesting feature about incels, and I think you heard Heidi mention this earlier, but there is this crossover, and we actually posted a blog on our website just last week that talks about this subset of white supremacist incels that promote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the Great Replacement theory. And they're using this white supremacist incel ideology to indoctrinate new members. It's particularly concerning that we have such narratives in forums frequented by vulnerable men, and it definitely poses a challenge to responding to the online violent misogynist threat. So incels is still something that I think we're all struggling to better understand. It is growing exponentially, as you can see from the graph there on the slide. But I would invite anybody to view our website where you can learn more about the incel phenomenon and some strategies to address that challenge. I want to close, sort of no pressure, right? Because you're the last speaker and everybody's ready to move on with their evening. But I want to reflect a little bit on the fact that I've been a counterterrorism practitioner for 20 years, and it took us a really long time. Really, it was too long for us to see that we had this growing metastasizing white supremacist problem, violent white supremacist problem in our country, in the United States. I won't, of course, speak for Canada, but it also has taken us way too long for us to invest in prevention. And one of the things that I have hope in is that we've turned that corner and we are building out local prevention capability. And when you have that offline capability, we would encourage everybody to consider that an online complement is necessary, a way to reach people where they're actually being radicalized and moving them to that one-on-one counseling or social services, wraparound services that can help get them the help they need before they cross into a path of violence. And with that, I just want to say thank you to all who are participating in this important conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. One thing that we've always, been so impressed by is the work that Moonshot is doing in helping to make such a difficult concept easily understood. And, we always love to share your work with stakeholders in government and organizations we're working with, particularly because it can have such a broadening of a person's understanding of the threats that we're facing in multiple areas, as we said in the beginning, like there's human trafficking, there's supremacist ideologies, there's terrorism, there's so many different challenges that the internet has really accelerated and caused to become crises. The incel difficulties around that. And I remember, Elliot Rogers. So he was one of the first people to be identified of this, and he killed some young women, I believe in California. And when this challenge occurred, there was not enough attention paid to the threat. So I feel that one of the things collectively we're doing now is saying, we have to pay attention. We have to educate and inform and build awareness. As Ryan was saying, like everyone has a responsibility to this. It's not just one individual or one organization. But again, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the work you and Moonshot have been doing. I can't thank our speakers enough for spending their time. I know actually we're all over the world. Some of us are in Europe, some are in East Coast, West Coast, and to all come together really because we care about people. We care about those who are being, affected by white supremacist ideology, whether as victims directly or people who are being brainwashed, as Tony said, to come at this with, radical compassion. And for many people to bring them inside as opposed to kicking them out. We've had a lot of perspective shared today. We've had people, and I'll mention this again, collectively over a century of experience in dealing with this challenge was on the call today. So thank you so much, everyone. I want to really highlight my colleague Tarek, who helped bring this all together. He's been doing such amazing work at helping to build the real world networks that are required to challenge this as well as other social challenges that we're all collectively facing. Tarek, do you have maybe some words as we end tonight?
I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to you, Yusuf, for moderating and really conducting a fantastic forum and introducing our guests and really tying all the pieces together. So thank you, Yusuf. Thank you to everybody. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to working with you ongoing on this critical issue, and heartfelt gratitude and appreciation for you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful night. Stay safe. And we'll see you tomorrow as we all continue this work together. Take care.